I don't like anime is a robustly negative statement that can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and for me it means that I vastly prefer my stories to be slow burn, character-driven narratives with compelling world building, which anime typically doesn't offer. There are a few, and it's the reason why I liked these titles, but not these ones. It also helps if the appearances of some characters aren't pointedly made so that the other characters can sexually harass them in dialogue. I mean, there's no clever point being made, it's plain uncomfortable and exploitative. Why the writers gave JoJo an Oedipus complex, I'll never know. Occasionally, a title so mind-bogglingly inconsistent will fall out of the sky and be immediately entertaining for its setting primarily, followed closely by its writing that rivals that of pieces found on fanfiction.net. Danganronpa falls into that same category for me, because while the setting, world building, and characters are all ridiculous to the point of parody, it's all a very well made one, and that's all due to the meticulous attention to details that, on a broader scale, really don't matter. And heck, right up until I played V3, I'd almost dare to say that I enjoyed the soap opera. But the way that V3 ended made me realize an all too crucial detail that permeates the series and ruins Danganronpa from being an immediate recommendation among visual novels. It never fully commits. It never fully commits to ideas or points of great consequence, instead relying on another wild and wacky twist in the story to subvert any foundation of principles, rules, dogmas, or all of the above that the series tries to establish itself upon. For those of you who don't know what Danganronpa is, it's going to sound like I made this all up while I was sleep deprived and experiencing fever dreams, and for those of you who do, you already know that's exactly what it sounds like. The premise across the three main games goes something like this. 16 characters are kidnapped and placed inside of a location that they can't escape from, and are told that their only way to regain their freedom is to kill another person in the party and get away with it. It's basically Among Us, the visual novel. But these 16 characters are never just your average run-of-the-mill people, no. They are described as ultimates, meaning that they are uncontested in terms of a specific talent. The talents on display range from normal skill-related things like the ultimate artist to weirdly niche talents like the ultimate moral compass. Moral compass, huh? While looking like that? And that's also not the weirdest part of it. Every single one of these characters are supposed to be in high school, including Nekomaru from the second game. Like, how the And every single one of them is introduced with some blurb about their achievements leading up to that point, several of which would take some professionals their entire lives, while they did it before they turned the age of 20. The main villain in this is, and without delving into any spoilers here for now, a monochromatic robot bear named Monokuma. They are presented as an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent character who watches every one of the students' actions through a massive network of security cameras and will occasionally influence what they call the killing game by implementing new time limits or rules periodically. And last thing to establish, after someone has been murdered, and this happens a lot, the player is then asked to inspect different clues surrounding the murder, which they then use to sleuth out the perpetrator during a non-structured debate segment filled with minigames, shouting, and a lot of pointless backtracking. Once the murderer is found, they are publicly executed in ways that are equal parts cruel and bizarre, to the point where I genuinely feel bad for the characters. Well, most of them. The debate sections, aka class trials, are both the life and death of this game for me. On one hand, Danganronpa only moves forward when a murder happens, and most of the game's craziest twists and turns occur only during these segments. The person that I least suspect is usually the murderer, which adds to the drama and makes me feel smart for a split second about uncovering them. Unfortunately, the player isn't allowed to feel clever because of how they're forced through a visual novel that, despite the deaths of the characters, has unrealistically low stakes. If I haven't uncovered all of the clues that the game wants me to, I'm stuck in the evidence room until I've clicked on everything so that it's certain that I get every tiny tidbit of information that I need. To condense my point slightly, what I'm upset about is that in this extremely bleak and violent setting, I'm never given the option to fail outside of hitting Alt F4 on the game and never coming back. If the player doesn't succeed during a class trial, Monokuma says,
"Oh wow, looks like everyone thinks you're the killer. I guess you die now."
Followed immediately by a sign that says, "Hey, would you like to try again?" which then heals the trial meter back to full and gives us a chance to pick up where we left off with 0 repercussions. And sometimes I would intentionally fail segments because I knew that one of the clunky minigames was coming up, and I wanted to make sure I could blast through it without a care in the world for my health bar, lest I be forced to start the minigame itself all over again. I know that this approach to gameplay ruins my ability to get some achievements for the game, but to be blunt, I don't care. There's not enough agency given in the parts of the game that would benefit greatly from me being kicked in the ass for not paying attention, and instead all the information is practically spoon-fed to me. All I need to do is click and put the right info together, like being asked to solve the last piece of a 4-piece jigsaw puzzle. Then there's the backtracking and constant repeating of phrases, and from what few anime titles I have seen so far, this seems to be a recurring thing, where a character will repeat what they just heard if they're surprised by something. I have also been told that anime is a horrible representation of how Japanese people speak normally, which makes sense, because if, for example, someone from overseas saw Riverdale as their only frame of reference for the way that Americans speak, what the hell are you doing watching Riverdale in the first place? Danganronpa abuses this stigma constantly though, as characters will repeat phrases as if they'd never heard some specific words before and can't accept them outright.
There was a cast iron pan found next to the body, possibly the cause of the blunt force trauma.
Whoa! Did you say cast iron pan?
Yeah, a size 3 cast iron pan to be exact. Probably taken from a kitchen around here somewhere.
A kitchen?
Yes, a kitchen. Is there an echo in here? If I don't catch the clue on one of the debate segments or misclick on the wrong one, I have to listen to that same dialogue over again. This in turn artificially extends the runtime of the game out for what feels like several hours more than it needs to be, and makes character interactions a bit of an eye roller. What I do find commendable about the series is the sheer amount of detail that goes into every murder and how each one feels unique from the last as a result. Different methods, different ways of covering their tracks, and some pieces of evidence that point to completely different people at times. The sheer amount of thoughtfulness that goes into these segments make the murders the most exciting parts of the game, as terrible as that sounds. When a murder happens, that's when I know that the story is moving forward again. The details that the game forces me to look at are all different facets of a much larger gem that could be worked into a more compelling murder mystery, given that the remainder of the format wasn't made for people who think that a fart smells like their favorite home cooking. And I should clarify that the visual novel is one of my least favorite game genres, which might seem odd considering that some of my favorite games are hardly more than what Danganronpa has to offer. But if I'm getting my genres correct here, I believe that games like Sunless Skies and Night in the Woods, while very heavily tied to the idea of reading walls of text from a certain character or location at a time, are classified as adventure titles. The difference between Sunless Skies and Danganronpa being that I can interact with as much of the stories I'm interested in Sunless Skies, and each choice that I make can gradually lead to slightly different outcomes for my character. There is an adventure segment in Danganronpa that breaks up the visual novel where the player can go and talk with other characters at length. Each time that the player chooses to talk with them, the more that they talk about their past or a specific interest of theirs. And given the somewhat limited opportunities that were presented to me, I felt like I had to divide my attention between characters that I was most interested in should they be dead in the next chapter. You're telling me that there's a character in this game who is a reverse weeb, heavily subscribes to the mantras of various serial killers, and to the point where it's actually a turning point in one of the class trials? That's kind of hilarious in a slightly hysterical sense. But regardless of what I do or do not learn about certain characters doesn't end up mattering too much in the end. If a character is set to die or is an integral part of a class trial, they usually dump all of their exposition that I may or may not have learned at that exact moment, leaving any self-discovery or possible clues that I could have picked up on through interactions with them as a pointless mark in the grand timeline of in-game events. Why even bother spending time to get to know these characters if all of that, quote, personal interaction means nothing when these characters decide to drop that all publicly anyway? There's no subtle payoff or knowledge that if this character dies, all those things die with them without any of the other characters knowing, which would make their deaths that much more tragic. For a game that sets up death as a horrible tragedy, which it is in any context, Danganronpa's reliance on poorly paced character development trivializes the tragedies of its own characters. In DR2, there's a post-game segment that sets up an alternate reality, one where nothing bad ever happens to the characters to start their mutual murder, and one that I feel defeats the purpose of the invisible timer on some of these characters' lives. Sure, I get to uncover more minute pieces of lore and engage in basically a dating sim, but the most interesting parts were already revealed in the main part of the game. At this point, it really is just playing a dating sim, where the reward for completing a character's narrative arc is becoming a nonce. And you can't argue that this isn't the case when Hyoko's introduction points out that her main defining trait is that she is pedophile bait. So why even play Danganronpa? Well, I thought that the character designs were cool, I loved the soundtrack upon listening to it, and overall found some enjoyment in the ridiculous writing when I watched half of a playthrough of the first game. The larger world that the game itself is set in was also interesting enough to me to the point where I was willing to trudge through several hours worth of gameplay in order to get to the bigger picture and see if there was any payoff. The reason why I haven't complimented it as much, or even gone on to address my original thesis statement that the series, including the anime, never commits to anything, is largely because the specific examples that I can bring up are spoiler heavy and specific to titles that I observe them in. What I'm trying to point out here is that when I take a step back to look at Danganronpa, I fully recognize that there's very little that I enjoy foundationally. These aspects that sell this game are tied into the metaphorical window dressings with writing that's so awful at times that it's suddenly good again. And overall, I wouldn't recommend playing Danganronpa, as it's much more fun to watch somebody else play the game. And if nothing else, it's at least comedic for how much pain the game leaves people in. Trigger Happy Havoc is the game that feels truest to its form. For some reason, the best comparison I can think of is Pokemon, where the first game had really simple but unique designs, which gradually grew more complicated as the years went on. Here, despite some standout singular characteristics like Mondo's corncob hair and Celeste in general, a lot of the outfits worn by the characters are all fairly reasonable. Some slightly more eccentric than others, but even so, the choices on display here do well to subtly highlight their personalities first and their inexplicable talents second. As plain as it may be, these appearances really help ground the idea that these are high schoolers being forced through hell and not a collection of circus freaks. I mean, what the f are you? Some kind of clown? Since it was my introduction to the series, the initial experience from this game still sticks out in my mind, and its relatively limited art style lends itself to a lot of the greater themes of Danganronpa. There's something eerie about the plain and largely unmarked hallways and areas lit up with primary colors that gives everything a hollow and liminal feel. It's unsettling at first, but as the numbers start to dwindle, the run from my hotel room to the cafeteria or other parts of the map gradually started to feel colder and emptier. I don't get that feeling of emptiness with later installments, as their environments were lit better and had greater detail as a result of a larger budget, but when characters started dying in 2 or V3, there are still details for me to latch onto. But in Trigger Happy Havoc, there's fundamentally nothing there. It is, as I just said, unsettling. The only details that I can work with are the conversations, and let's put conversations in the biggest quote marks here, that other characters provide. Danganronpa right out the gates isn't afraid to show just how much of a visual novel it is, and that much is true with how it sets up the player's expectations with Sayaka. Oh, here's this cute anime girl in this visual novel that we've set up, and now she's dead. All of the characters are trapped in this abandoned high school by an animatronic bear, forced to investigate the visceral murders of their classmates, and then helplessly watch as the perpetrator is executed in a manner that definitely violates the 8th Amendment. Oh, sounds like the perfect time to strike up some romance and have small talk about the mundane. And I find it particularly hilarious that most of these people don't even start behaving more erratically as time goes by. In fact, according to some information from the government of Columbus, Georgia, a city of 200,000 people, a coroner is elected for a 4-year term, and their office investigates around 700 deaths a year. About 100 of those are then sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for autopsies, and I'd assume the number of deaths that they investigate, which are conducted by trained professionals, and the limited tenure indicates how the job itself can take a huge mental toll. But aside from Kyoko, none of these high schoolers have their talent in being the ultimate autopsy taker. Aside from perhaps Mondo as well, I highly doubt that any of them have seen a dead body in their lives either. And all of this to point out that the disconnect between most of the situations of the characters is hilarious to me. One day, Sayaka is dead with a knife lodged in her abdomen, the class trial starts that evening, and then the next morning characters are like, slightly bummed out, I guess? I get that they don't really know each other and that she wasn't the most pure of heart and only used Makoto as a ways to escape the killing game, but I still find the difference between the event and the nigh immediate reaction to be unrealistic, if not hilarious in its own twisted way. Conversely, the death of Sakura later in the game had some real emotional exasperations. These were clearly seen in Aoi's reaction to hearing the news, making me believe that the writers only made the characters care about deaths when they, the writers, cared about the characters themselves. And this repeats itself throughout the rest of the series, so I won't harp on about this too much, but it is important for me to bring to your attention to now, so that when this happens in other games further down the road, you'll see that this was something that was done right from the beginning. And also done right from the beginning, the diabolical twists and turns to this story, which are very, very creative. I mostly mean that in terms of the murders first, and then the overall story second. Chihiro's death is the most visually gruesome in this game, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the games in terms of storyline complexity. First, we're led to believe that she was killed in the women's locker room by a known serial killer, and since the game has implemented the idea that someone working for Monokuma is among the ranks of the rest of the squad, we're then led to believe that the serial killer and the traitor are the one and the same. As more information gets uncovered though, we find out that the so-called telltale signs of the serial killer are missing some vital pieces, and that she is actually a he, and that he was killed in the men's locker room before being moved across to the women's locker room. And the only reason that Chihiro's body is found like this is because Byakuya was getting bored and he wanted to throw in a red herring by messing with the crime scene. Condensing the mystery of Chihiro's death down to a single paragraph really makes me wonder why over 2 hours can be spent investigating the details. It'd be one thing if those things were revealed subtly and if the player had agency in finding out those details, you know, like an actual murder mystery. But unfortunately, Danganronpa is so transparent and so hellbent on making sure that I understand those details to the point where it drops pretty much everything I need to know within the first 15 minutes of gameplay. And I found this to be particularly aggravating in the first game because of Kyoko. A lot of things about Kyoko irritate me. In a vacuum, she's a cool character. I love her design, her personality, and how the writers gave her a tangible reason as to why she wears gloves all the time, something that the story gradually reveals to the player. In the context of Danganronpa though, she gets under my skin in tandem with how the player is assigned a character that the writers do nothing with. I mean, every time I'm asked to investigate a murder, the dialogue is written more to make it seem like I stumbled upon the evidence and it's Kyoko doing all of the work. Yet sometimes Kyoko jumps to a conclusion that could have never been extrapolated from the evidence we gathered, and she acts all coy about having this secret information. And even worse, sometimes Danganronpa forgets that there's a player involved in interacting with their story until Kyoko turns to the camera and says, "Hey Makoto, why don't you tell them?" As if she wasn't already taking over the entire investigation herself. It's almost comical with how poorly paced these interactions are in class trials. The detective is giving their case, and then when it gets to the most plainly obvious path, that's when I'm allowed to supplement. It's like those college classes that everyone dreads in their first year, where the teacher will leave a very clear blank open at the end of a sentence, and they'll expect people to answer while wanting to move on to their next point anyway.
Well, judging by the rounded fracture on the back of the skull, we can conclude that the cause of death was... Actually, why don't you tell them, Makoto?
Blunt force trauma. That's right! Blunt force trauma!
It's as if the writers were so focused on writing their own story with Danganronpa, which can be entertaining at times, and then they remembered that they have to include the player at some points. Yet at the same time, it's not really the player, but more of a player character? So let's consider something like Telltale's Walking Dead game, where the player takes on the role of Lee. While the dialogue choices and decisions I make can slightly vary interaction in that game and shape Lee into the character that I make him out to be, the distinction is that Lee has a personality that other people in the game interact with depending on what he chooses to say to them. The choices may be player-led, but the result is a dynamic protagonist, separate from the story that the game itself wants to tell, with an ending that doesn't change regardless of your choices. But DR1 on the other hand leads the player to believe that they're playing as Makoto Naegi, aided by the fact that he is devoid of his own personality. Makoto is completely defined by the narrative end that Trigger Happy Havoc wants to work towards, completely emptying Naegi of any volition so that the player can masquerade as him. Makoto and the person behind the screen are treated as one and the same, being dragged around by Danganronpa's insistence on repeating its points so often that they are impossible to get wrong. The suspense of a mystery novel is knowing that the detective has the potential to get things wrong and suffer the consequences. But when the detectives are people who can't get anything wrong and are given a massive safety net to work around, that's where the suspense starts to fall apart, further diminished by how every crime scene is a paint-by-number sequence. Earlier, I said that the murders were the most interesting parts of the games as a whole, but Trigger Happy Havoc makes its intentions clear from the very first murder.
Some sort of sharp object has been thrust into her stomach. Oh my god. Oh my fucking god.
This game was made for babies. I'm convinced.
We find Sayaka, dead in one of the dormitory bathrooms thanks to a knife lodged in her epigastric region. And through the paint-by-number sequence that follows, we're able to deduce some fairly harrowing information. In the days leading up to her death, Sayaka, world-renowned pop star high school prodigy, befriended Makoto, who was busy staring at his character reference sheet. It's blank. She claimed that she heard someone frantically trying to open her door to kill her one night, and in her fright asked to swap rooms with Makoto the following night. What we learned is that Makoto is a suck-up, as Sayaka wanted to swap rooms with Makoto so that she could seduce one of the other students, murder them, and then blame it on Makoto so that they would be dead in his room. A twist of fate happened, Sayaka's victim became the assailant, and she was the one who ended up dead in Makoto's room instead. Twisted? Oh, absolutely. And I love the writing that went into making these concepts a reality. There's just one slight problem. As Sayaka was drawing her final breaths, she wrote the name of her murderer on the wall behind her in blood, meaning that we spend all of this time figuring out this information, knowing full damn well who did it, or at least whom we should look into immediately. This could perhaps come down to the game's translation from Japanese to English, as Japanese people playing this game might not recognize the English letters immediately and take them as numbers, as the game heavily suggests. Ooh, it's not Leon, it's 11037. What could that possibly mean? But regardless, this whole rigmarole of dancing around the clear and obvious conclusion with no input from the player being allowed to either speed up or possibly mess up the deduction is made clear from the get-go, and it continues for every single murder in every single game thereafter. Trigger Happy Havoc has an ending that it wants the player to work towards. There's the ending that you can get where you kill Kyoko instead of Makoto and everyone lives in the school forever, but that's treated as the bad and false ending, and it's the only time in the rest of the games that this possible bad ending is ever used. Heck, the decision is only ever given when the game is positively certain that the player can't do anything else about it. Otherwise, Mr. Mayonnaise himself is a train car where the locomotive engine of the game's story drives on a straight track with no deviance whatsoever. It's cool scenery, I guess, but the destination is one we're expected to arrive at, given all the not-so-subtle narrative hints that are dropped and repeated throughout this game's playtime. And after all of the trials and all of the clues of these characters' origins are gradually revealed, the ending yields a dark dystopian alternate universe that puts these high schoolers at the center of it all. The world building itself I found to be interesting in passing, like reading headlines from the Today I Learned subreddit, and it all starts with the ending from this game. Each of the characters is called an ultimate. Each of the characters is called an ultimate because they are considered to be the best of the best talents for their specified skill. When humanity started to collapse as a result of a currently unknown world-ending catastrophe only referred to as the greatest, most tragic event in human history, gee, I wonder how certain ethnic groups feel about that one, they locked away these last remaining talent bearers inside of their former school. We find out that Monokuma, controlled by Junko Enoshima, the instigator of aforementioned world-ending events, thought it would be hilarious if they removed all of the characters' memories and forced them to kill each other. Then, Junko broadcasted their mutual destruction to the remainder of humanity to show that
there can be no hope in this hell. No hope at all.
The characters that are in Trigger Happy Havoc we virtually see nothing of for the remainder of the series. Celeste, Mondo, Kiyotaka, Leon, Sayaka, and so forth. Well, aside from glancing references and nods made to them in DR2 and 3, none of them are ever seen again, and with them their personalities and talents, giving some sense of finality. I think having most of them to be one-and-done scenarios does a lot to sell the message of how violence is pointless and cyclical regardless of who gets caught in its crossfire. The characters that do survive this game go on to show up in other games and are there for a reason, and they couldn't have done that without this game to launch off of. What I am a little upset about in terms of this first game's commitment is in regards to Chihiro and his death. Chihiro was a computer super genius, and in part of trying to uncover the secrets of Monokuma, created an AI using a box of scraps in a 2005 Dell laptop. 9 magical abilities, remember? The AI uses Chihiro's face as its face, so even after Chihiro's death, we still have a part of him to remember him by. It's like, alright, sure, we can let this slide. I would have preferred if the hours I spent investigating someone's death had the emotional payoff of them being actually dead, but it's fine because this game is wild anyway. But Monokuma finds the laptop that the AI is on and destroys it later in the game, leaving the audience to believe that the AI is gone forever, and Chihiro effectively dies a second time until he doesn't. Inadvertently, through these multiple pseudo-resurrections, Danganronpa's message about the finality and the cruelty of death becomes a shaky one. Just like before with the emotional blowback of Sakura's suicide, the writers make it blatantly obvious from day one that they will highlight the characters they care about, regardless if it should make sense or not for the greater themes, story, or world that the title is set in. It might very well be a simple framework, but it's a framework that will go on to define the shape of the house for later installments yet to come. Goodbye Despair is the best sequel that this game series could have asked for. It's funny, Hajime has a bit of personality compared to Makoto, and if I were in his shoes, I would have murdered Nagito on day 1 in broad daylight. It is quite possibly the funniest and best of the games, perfectly represented as an isolated island oasis as it floats among the ocean of other related content. But following the ending of Trigger Happy Havoc, a sequel seemed unlikely because, logistically speaking, where do you go from here? Good sequels will answer that by saying that the next logical step is to expand on the franchise's lore, moving the scope of problems from one specific set of characters to a much broader spectrum, and in Danganronpa's case, exploring more of the concept of Hope's Peak Academy as a school by establishing yet another class of exactly 16 individuals, and exploring more of the events that were mentioned in Trigger Happy Havoc, but never fully explained. The argument here could be that Spike Chunsoft was treating this like how Star Wars has been treating their IP recently, by over-explaining stories that don't really need an explanation. And while I liked Rogue One for its grittier elements, making it relate to A New Hope felt more like an obligation rather than doing literally anything else with the Star Wars IP. Nevertheless, I still felt like Goodbye Despair was tonally distinct because of how weird it is. The game starts off by introducing us to Uzami, a rabbit that insists that it's the student's teacher, is strangely similar in shape to Monokuma, and who wants nothing but for the students to become best of friends with each other. They're on a field trip on a tropical island. They have everything they could ever want to live there, and the soundtrack has steel drums in it. Surely nothing can go wrong, and not even the header art in the Steam library could possibly feature the main antagonist from the first game. The largest mystery of this game actually lies in the last bit. If Junko was killed in Trigger Happy Havoc, how is Monokuma on the header art? And as this question seeks in, the introduction to Goodbye Despair feels rather padded out. The time that it spends ruminating over the natures of each individual student against Uzami's insistence that this is a safe space doubles down on the matter of not how does this turn interesting, but rather when. Before we can get around to the interesting part though, we need to uncover each of the characters and their defining traits. Compared to Trigger Happy Havoc, the best single word descriptor I can use for the characters here in Goodbye Despair is unhinged. And this extends beyond their personalities to include their physical appearances as well. So Sayaka, from the first game, is the superstar, world-renowned pop idol, but she wears the familiar school uniform. She's passively nice, a heavy manipulator, and not much can really be said about her because she suffered an unmitigated gastroenterostomy. Hiyoko in this game, on the other hand, is a professional traditional dancer, has the personality of a chihuahua, and in her introduction, the game's dialogue tells the player that she is bait because of how young she is. Whether that's a meta comment or not, I'm not entirely certain, but Hiyoko is among one of many extreme examples here. Nekomaru is built like a battering ram and is extremely passionate about his constipation. Peko Peko is cold and subservient. Kazuichi is the simp that constantly thirsts over Sonya, and Akane is the dumb as bricks gymnast who loves to eat and also has massive boobs that the writing makes a point to talk about on a regular basis. On top of being unhinged, this game is filled to the brim with an uncomfortable amount of sensual writing. The game opens on Akane trying to strip down naked to swim at the beach because she has no sense of decency. In Chapter 1 and throughout the rest of the game, Mikan consistently trips and falls into positions where she's basically presenting herself. In Chapter 2, there's a portion where each of the main female characters show up to a diner dressed in swimsuits. Again, maybe it's the writing leaning into the unchecked hormonal imbalance of teenagers, but bearing witness to this while also knowing full well that the characters are meant to be high school age is extremely uncomfortable for me. And before anyone argues against this, I would like to reiterate that everyone is supposed to be in the same year, and Hiyoko's introduction states that she is pedo bait. If she's bait, then so are the rest of them. Even if there is a time skip that is canonical to the events of the game at the end of the game, the point still remains that they believe themselves to be their younger, minor selves. This is all part of a similar warning to anyone who hasn't played the game before, that the writing hits points of uncomfortability. You know the type, where you invite your conservative parents to watch a mystery movie with you, completely forgetting that there's a flagrant sex scene in the first 20 minutes type deal. Maybe I'm projecting. The Ultimates in Goodbye Despair are far more diverse and memorable, which quite often sets them up to be hilarious caricatures. Not so much in the witty way, because the hand-holding and repetition of lines is still very much at play here, but more in the I cannot believe that this is an actual character type of way. It's absurdist humor in a manner of speaking, but it absolutely fits for this world. And heck, since the themes of this game are deeply set in dark topics such as violent homicide and the virtue of man, some semblance of comedy was desperately needed. Fuyuhiko, the Manulet Yakuza member. There it is! There it is! Ibuki, the esoteric musician.
Oh my goodness.
Alright then. And Gundam Tanaka.
Jesus Christ. Ultimate Breeder.
And when we consider that these are high schoolers trapped against their will on a mysterious island by these two jokers, everything else should follow a similar style of whimsicality to varying degrees, and it does. And what sells me even more on the writing is that every character maintains the same personality in all situations. In the face of adversity or tragedy, Gundam begins spouting slightly more serious nonsense. Fuyuhiko's sentence often devolves to just the no-no words, and Ibuki remains her weird self. Except for that, that's a medical condition. If Trigger Happy Havoc was the framework that set up Danganronpa, then Goodbye Despair was the title that fully embraced all of its little weird qualities, making it distinct from any other number of visual novels out there. Now, those are all of the aspects that I felt were notably improved, and heck, if you stop to think about it, visual novels are mostly in written form, and the writing here was somewhat manageable. Somewhat. In the time that it's taken me to write this and review footage and re-record the game, I begrudgingly started to understand that just like poor Sakura in the first game, the writing also picks and chooses what events it wants to. The pacing, regardless of unabashedly outrageous writing, is like molasses. This is a murder mystery game at its core, with a bigger mystery set behind it. When there is a murder to solve or the lore-related mystery unravels itself, that's when the game shines the brightest. So bright, in fact, that the rest of Goodbye Despair is dull by comparison. It feels strange to say, but at 2 games in, the bulk effort really does go into the more striking occurrences, while the dialogue in between is left to rot. Fake Byakuya gets stabbed to death at the party, and it's like, woo!
Woo! Yeah! Something finally happened!
Followed by the necessity to gather every single person's opinion on the matter. You ever seen Detroit Become Human?
Yes.
28 stab wounds!
Oh.
Then the trial starts, at which point I already have all the information that I need, and still the game is insistent on dragging me through every minute detail, derailed further by the minigames. The minigames, while the updated Hangman's Gambit was better than the first game, still feel like a needless distraction amid everything. It was almost as if the writers remembered that the player character was there, needed to give them something to do, and it definitely sets the visual novel apart from other visual novels, but I can't help but find it a little insulting that A, I already understand 75% of the evidence that's been presented and need just a few things to click together, and B, someone is dead. So let's drive a taxi in a straight line through some synthwave backgrounds? Funny enough, one of the only times that a logical fallacy is used by any of the characters during these debate sections is when they start talking about information that has already been predetermined as useless. The red herring fallacy, in other words. Even if they're written to be timid characters, everyone seems so sure of themselves to the point that no other logical fallacies are ever made, at least none that matter in the grand scheme of things. Sure, there are some parts in these useless debate segments where the ad hoc fallacy is brought up, but it's never taken as a reason to doubt the perpetrator of said fallacy. And when the glacial pacing is matched with characters who generally make factual statements about things we already know without ever naturally dipping into flawed arguments, these debate sections become robotic. And to make matters worse, every last minute detail or possible counter-argument has to be covered, even if I already knew that it was an insignificant detail, unless debates are still dragged out to the longest possible degree. And I understand that this is more of a result of the visual novel genre, and that I'm asking too much for these games to be a true mystery novel. Realistically, the issue lies in what I've stated before, how the more exciting story events are heavily contrasted by how nothing about any of the other characters ever changes, except for one in this game. And far and away, the highlight of Goodbye Despair lies in Fuyuhiko's character arc, the only character with an arc. He goes from having the best line in the game to becoming a much more mellow, melancholy, but still sharp leader by the end of it. It is surprising, considering everything else around the character. And the same can be somewhat said about Komaeda, my least favorite character in the game, because he's annoying as hell. I understand the point of the character to constantly speak like some deranged false prophet about the virtues of hope and despair and how they're interwoven concepts, but it's a little too rich. It's a little too much like the writers were taking themselves seriously when characters like Akane and Nekomaru exist. Then there's Hajime, who, unlike bland protagonist number 1, often has an opinion of his own or reactions to certain things that don't always line up with the obvious path. He's still a bland, vanilla kind of anime protagonist for sure, but there's a hint of honey mixed in there that makes him stand out. Alright, but despite all the time that I spent talking about DR2 so far, there's nothing that could have prepared me for the ending. Throughout the game, the characters repeatedly note how bizarre it is that there's nobody on this placid tropical island that is supposed to be an ideal tourist destination. The airplanes at the airport are missing their engines, and most everything looks like it's been previously untouched by man. Granted, not a whole lot of the islands make any logistical sense. The home island is the one that is the most realistic, with a hotel, a nice relaxing beachside, and a convenience store. And look, that last one might sound like a bit of a stretch, but anyone who lives in Southeast Asia can attest to the fact that there are 7-Elevens just about everywhere. But then, on the first island, there's also a farm? And then on the second island, there's a beach house, which is normal, a 60s themed burger diner, and a library, which is not. Island number 3 has a whole-ass motel, a hospital, and a sleazy rock venue called Titty Typhoon. I mean, that last one is totally unrealistic. There was a complete lack of titty in that building. My point is that as the islands progress, they seem more and more frantically designed. For this island, we'll throw in a library. Okay, next we'll have I don't know, an amusement park with a little dollhouse and a castle that's definitely not modeled after the one at Disneyland. And just like the game before it, the mystery of the island goes deeper than the murders within. There is, once again, the question of what they're all doing there and who they really were prior to losing all their memories. The biggest turning point for this is on the 4th island, where the lucky Nagito Komaeda gets the opportunity to look through an entire docket on everyone there. But because Nagito is a prick, he never fully reveals the details, with the only major thing being that Hajime never belonged to the class in the first place. He was a reserve corps student, a talentless schmuck that got swept up in all of this somehow. And we'll talk more about the reserve corps in the segment on the anime. And then there's also the mysterious ancient building overgrown with jungle vines with the word future written on the front of it. At the entrance is a keypad with a wall-mounted minigun pointed directly at it, effectively saying that if the passcode is entered wrong, you will be turned into a red goo. When the game finally comes to a close and the passcode is discovered, several things start to tear at the fabric of reality. Characters that were dead in earlier chapters start reappearing and disappearing at unexpected intervals, and upon entering the ancient building, we find that it's actually the original Hope's Peak Academy, complete with a much more empty and desolate trial room, where this time we put Monokuma on blast. The walls start shifting. Lines of code begin appearing in the middle of the screen, and we start receiving communication from an outside source. None other than Makoto Naegi from the first game. As it turns out, and as was heavily indicated throughout the game, the entire world that we've interfaced with is nothing more than the Matrix, a simulated reality made to try and psychologically reform the people within. Listen, I know this sounds far-fetched, but the more that you think of Danganronpa as a science fiction property, the easier it becomes. What happened in Trigger Happy Havoc was real, and the ending reveal of how it's actually the end of the world was also a total truth being told by Monokuma. The end of the world brought on specifically by 15 of the students in Goodbye Despair and their ultimate talents. Makoto and the other surviving students in Trigger Happy Havoc managed to find all 15 of the students and introduce them into the Neo World program, this simulation which was meant to help rewire their brains so that they weren't bent on destroying the world any further. Ergo, their lost memories, ergo the bizarre nature of everything around them, as it was a collection of their own fragmented memories. The reason why Monokuma showed up in the first place was because Izuru Kamakura, also known as Hajime Hinata, wanted to see if hope or despair would be the ultimate winner in the only place on Earth that was left a blank slate, unaware that he would be caught by the power of the program itself as well. We actually get a look into his interaction with Komaeda just prior to entering the Neo World program. Prior, Komaeda, so hellbent on the intertwined nature of despair and hope, is seen in the same cabin as Kamakura, with a woman's hand supplanted onto his own wrist. It's Junko's hand. Komaeda put that hand there himself in place of his own, with the idea that her despair was a part of him now. Komaeda is insane and should have been shot on frame 1. And it sounds really far-fetched, sure, but this is the popcorn-munching, dumb, fun science fiction tropes that the lore-addicted gremlin in my brain loves to consume. Does it have to make logical sense? In this case, no, because the storyline hasn't gotten convoluted yet. At this point, everything is a reasonable series of events for the series that points in a similar direction, combined with some memorable characters. It all makes sense for now. And there's one very, very important detail that I need you to remember that we're told and that the characters have a whole 10-minute segment dedicated to, is this singular idea. If a character dies in the simulation, they die in real life. This, of course, means that the apparitions we see at the end of the game are nothing more than fragmented memories created by the other people in the simulation, but as soon as the simulation is left, they are no longer among the living. It's harrowing and dark, perfectly mirroring the dire stakes that Trigger Happy Havoc ended on with only a small handful of survivors. In some ways, it also speaks to the consequences of the actions of the remnants of despair, where their power came at the cost of the lives of these people that they were reprogrammed to remember for all the good things that they represented. And sure, they were international terrorists at this point, but this again loops back to the question that Danganronpa likes to ask of how much is too much, even for these terrible people that had a really good shot at redemption. We would likely never know, as their chances were cut irreparably short by short-sightedness and the senseless cycle of violence. And if there are any highlights to be had from the Danganronpa series as a whole, I'd say that Goodbye Despair is the best of the games given its writing. It's whimsical and over the top in all of the best and worst ways, but it's also solemn, twisted, and creative in the way that it chooses to advance the storyline in a semi-tangible manner. Well, and it's at least a little more coherent than what follows it shortly afterwards. Hi, I'm SojournerKai. I still hate anime. For those of you unfamiliar with Danganronpa 3, the series is split into two halves that mirror each other. There's the Despair arc, and there's the Future arc, which are to be watched in an alternating fashion. They combine for a total of 23 episodes that ends with the Hope episode, making it 24 altogether. The series is effectively a comprehensive lore update to the details that we were exposed to in the first two games, really diving into the two classes at Hope's Peak Academy, as well as the cause of the school's downfall. And I know that I was bashing on Star Wars earlier for making adaptations of crucial events that didn't need explanation, but this is different, because in Star Wars we know that Han Solo is named Han Solo, and that the Rebels got the Death Star schematics through espionage. These are already verifiable and tangible facts in-universe that don't need film adaptations to explain them. But in Danganronpa, however, all the facts that we're presented with are handed to us mostly via Monokuma. He could just as easily be fabricating every detail of these people's former lives. Now when the anime comes in, it makes Monokuma's statements true, which in some ways is even more twisted for the monochromatic bear. Not only is he telling the truth, but he's telling it believing full well that none of the students under his watchful eye will ever escape. It also verifies the prophecy and influence of the Future Foundation while expanding the lore of Hope's Peak Academy even further. Former classes with other talented individuals are making it powerful organizations, making Hajime's aspirations to become one of the lucky few all the more realized. And I'm also particularly fond of the anime because it removes the player from the world. I know, kind of a weird thing to be praising a property based off of a video game for, but by removing the player from the world no longer has to awkwardly interact with a fourth wall all the time. There's no time spent on crunching a bunch of regrettable minigames or musing over data, just a goal and a story to tell. The characters within are allowed to come and go as they please, and don't have to spend time worrying about whatever milquetoast I would have to pretend to be. The Future arc is set immediately after the events of Goodbye Despair. Makoto Naegi is brought in on trial for trying to rehabilitate the remnants of Despair, as the other members of the Future Foundation understood that these dangerous individuals were to be executed when they were caught. The trial is interrupted by none other than Monokuma, and suddenly the high-rise building where the meeting is taking place becomes another death game. But this time, instead of being able to investigate individual murders, it's more of a death game where the goal is to find the secret traitor among the Future Foundation. And to make things even more interesting, everyone has been equipped with a bracelet that will supposedly inject every person with a narcotic at regular intervals, save for the secret killer. You know, Town of Salem style. The bracelet's second purpose is to inject a lethal chemical into the bloodstream of any individual who performs the forbidden action written on the bracelet, which is different for each person. Of course, since Makoto was brought in under suspicion of working for the enemy, a good majority of the Future Foundation suspect him of being the killer. Throughout the rest of the Future arc, it's all about Makoto, Kyoko, and Aoi trying to work together to unmask the killer while trying to avoid the Future Foundation members that want to outright kill Makoto. In a few words, the anime is suspenseful, it's dramatic, and it's kind of fun. The animation is nice, and since I watched with subtitles, I liked the VA work because Japan actually cares about its VAs. I'm not praising the anime for being a good piece of media. I'm praising the anime because it feels like the format that Danganronpa was actually designed for. Beyond the synopsis, though, there are a landslide of writing complaints that I have with the Future arc, and it all culminates in its conclusion. The two games preceding it set this installment up to be a comprehensive end to questions we might have had before, so that the series had a robust foundation going forward. If it didn't go forward from here, then wrapping up prior details would have been a satisfying ending to it all. Instead, I'm here to tell you that I am both upset and dissatisfied. It is in the anime where the title of this video becomes all the more clear. Danganronpa never commits to any condemning idea, even going as far as to eliminate core themes from the games and making retroactive changes to very crucial events. I'd even argue that the themes of the two games prior centered themselves around the idea of the permanence of death. Yes, there's also finding hope in the light of despair and the argument of how much we should hold people accountable for murder. In some ways, with the flamboyant and cruel executions, it's quite easy to say for certain characters that this really is too far. But regardless, whether it's in the moments leading up to an execution or the sudden discovery of a body, that person stays dead. Dead is dead. It's such a somber topic that the only other times that characters fake their own death or injury is for their own personal benefit, which doesn't end up working out too well in their favor a lot of the time. There he is, now he's dead.
Dedge.
Edge. And so, in episode 2, after the first countdown, Makoto wakes up to find Aoi next to him with a knife sticking out of her abdomen, blood covering and staining her lifeless body. But oh wait, it's a prank, guys. It was tomato sauce the whole time. And I guess I can see the logic behind faking Aoi's death from the perspective of other characters involved in the scene, but it actively antagonizes the central theme. Death is permanent and sudden, and Aoi, one of Makoto's only allies who can make a neat comeback in the anime, is dead. But just kidding. It's actually this other guy here that's dead, but we don't care as much about him because he wasn't in any of the other titles. Then, partway through the series, this character who looks like Chad Kroger shows up and supposedly has a notable history as one of Kyoko's mentors. Hi, SojournerKai from the future here. I really don't like how I talk about Koichi Kizakura in this segment, and it really rubbed me the wrong way so much that I'm actually going to interject and override my points here, although I do think that what I have to say does kind of tie in some sort of sensible manner. So Kizakura was actually there from the very beginning of the Despair arc. He was originally the homeroom teacher for the class that Chisa Yukizome eventually goes on to teach, which is the class with Chiaki Nanami, Akane Owari, Nekomaru, and all those characters, right? But because Kizakura is an alcoholic and a total slack-off, he decides to never show up, and so Chisa takes over the homeroom responsibility for him, even though she's technically not the homeroom teacher. Intermittently, Kizakura is seen talking with the headmaster, which is Jin Kirigiri, which is Kyoko Kirigiri's father, but a lot of their conversations in the Despair arc are kind of like, oh, look out because Despair is taking over the world and there might be something changing for the worst, and we need you to be looking out and be vigilant of that. Overall, in the Despair arc, Kizakura's presence is more of a comic relief character than anything. He's kind of just there, he's meant to be laughed at, he's meant to be shown as a sham of a character because he never fulfills his duty as a homeroom teacher. And it's only in episode 11, one of the last episodes of the Despair arc, that Kizakura even expresses this ideal, this want to protect Kirigiri's daughter. And so it seems really strange to me that in episode 8, where he dies, that his entire flashback is shown at the start of the episode, where it goes back to this time where he's fighting back the forces of despair, where he's said that he's going to be protecting Kyoko according to her father's wishes, when none of that wasn't really made clear to begin with. In fact, in episode 6 of the Future arc, Kyoko tells him to piss off and go somewhere else because she doesn't want him around, completely unaware of this promise because we really haven't been made aware of it ourselves, and Kyoko also doesn't know that Kizakura is trying to protect her because these characters have never interacted outside of Jin saying, hey, can you protect my daughter, in a much later episode. So this is more to say that I do understand that Chad Kroger, also known as Koichi Kizakura, did actually show up more regularly in the anime than I make it out to be, but the execution is made so separated from the actual point of it that it loses all meaning by the time that he does die in episode 8 of the Future arc. I hope that clears things up. I do apologize for having to interrupt you here, but let's get back on with the video. He is seen in other episodes, and he is a crucial part of some of the Despair arc as well, but in terms of his relationship to Kyoko, we get basically nothing aside from a line that shows up just before his death. In typical anime style, all of this backstory is also dropped at the start of the episode that he dies in, along with his promise to Kyoko's father to watch over her, and is again reiterated in the final moments before his death. This parallels almost exactly what the games have done before, taking a character that the player knows nothing about and was never given an opportunity to learn much from, despite the option to delve into their past being right there and left completely unused. Aw man, it would have been a real shame if we had several episodes of these Valorant E-Dater personalities and they took up narrative space that could have been filled by this extremely important person in Kyoko's life. That's just insanity. Hi, I'm SojournerKai. I hate this trope. Alright, so this very important and crucial person who helped shape Kyoko was discarded because death is permanent and the game is very real with a very real antagonist that they have to find a very real and creative conclusion to in order to make the time spent on the show feel like everyone's involvement holds weight. If you can't tell, I'm being facetious. There are two mysteries at hand here that ties the entire future arc together: the way that the murder game started and the identity of the secret killer. We find out the former via some sleuthing by our protagonists. As it turns out, the former headmaster of the Acoustic Academy was the one who intended on luring them all in and starting the game, once again in the name of despair. How he managed to move everybody after the sleeping gas or managed to get the bracelets on everyone by himself, or even with Yukizome's help, who we'll talk about in a second, is beyond me, but that's not exactly important. The headmaster being in control of events in the future arc does put a sick twist on the narrative covered in the Despair arc, and I honestly have zero complaints about it. It makes his death at the hand of Monakata in single combat all the more interesting, as he is the only character that dies at the hands of another. And on the other hand, we have these two characters whose involvement and appearances bring me insatiable rage: Ryota Mitarai and Chisa Yukizome. Mitarai has the power of the ultimate animator, even though he was never revealed in Goodbye Despair for narrative drama purposes. To make things short, the ultimate animator is a shut-in, like most animators, and doesn't want to attend school so that he can spend more time on his animations. The ultimate imposter offers to take his place and pretend to be him, as is mandated by the imposter's talent. Something along the lines of he only gains purpose by pretending to be somebody else, which, you know, kind of a cool storyline to follow. Ryota Mitarai then spends basically all of his time in the dorm working on his animations and only stopping to eat or drink when the imposter reminds him to do so. This ends up serving to his detriment later in the series as the animator collapses at his desk, which causes the imposter to call upon Mikan Tsumiki, the ultimate nurse, for help. And even then, the secret of Mitarai's existence along with the imposter's charade has to remain hidden for the sake of fragmented loyalty. Now, during this time, another student at Acoustic Academy begins her plot for world domination, Junko Enoshima, accompanied by her sister Mukuro Ikusaba. The dynamic that these two characters have in some of their scenes balances perfectly on the edge of sinister yet unrealistic and ridiculous supervillains. In one particular scene for their introduction, Junko tries to stab Mukuro to death, but because Mukuro is so experienced in hand-to-hand combat, she deflects the attacks with ease, sipping wine with one hand while she does it. And if that wasn't enough to prove Mukuro's prowess and Junko's deranged behavior, Junko then pulls out a grenade, and Mukuro uses the wine glass to deflect it safely out of their limousine window before it explodes on the road behind them. This entire encounter is passed off as normal, and the act of terrorism that they leave in their wake is never addressed. If a grenade went off on I-5, it would be in the news cycle for the next 6 weeks, but in the world of Danganronpa, it's another regular Tuesday morning, I guess. That's just how insane this world is. Now, consistently throughout her introduction, Junko is said to be a super genius, and that everything she does is part of some long-winded contingency that she has calculated will cause the irreparable damage for her to take over the world. Even better, her entire reason for committing the atrocities that she does is insatiable boredom. She knows everything there is to know about the world, driving her to seek pure unpredictability, found when her fellow humans are pushed to their emotional limits, therefore her obsession with despair, therefore the Danganronpa series. Her plan starts off simply: gather information on the dark secrets of Acoustic Academy by capturing members of the trustee board, done with the help of her sister's heightened ability in combat. They kill a few security guards, find their way to Izuru Kamakura, whom I can't talk about right now because it'll derail this whole section, and then proceed to use blackmail to force the student council to kill each other. After this first massacre happens, Junko blames it on Kamakura, a human experiment made by the school who has apparently gone rogue and killed innocent people out of spite for his fellow classmates. And seeing all this death and carnage in full animation compared to the game's pseudo 3D setting is awful and grotesque, even if it has been heavily censored. Maybe I'm more sensitive to it, as I've never been that great with gore, but with full context now, it's undeniable just how violent the great tragedy truly was. Aw, just look at how cute this heterochromatic anime girl with a hoodie is, and now she's dead. From what I understood about Junko's plan, though, this is where it ended. Torture a member of the school board, weasel your way into the campus by killing a few security guards, then coerce the student council into killing each other. If a grenade going off on a busy highway wasn't enough to warrant a news story, then surely the deaths of a few short of a score of students would hardly cause a ripple in the media cycle. Junko's plan dies out right then and there. But because we know that DR2 and DR1 exist, something has to happen, right? In some illogical turn of events, while Junko is admitted to the school hospital after Kamakura kicks the shit out of her, she happens to run into none other than the actual Ryota Mitarai on his way there. Remember earlier how Ryota would never leave his room so that he could always work on his animation? Remember how this is an important plot point because of how it lets him get discovered by Mikan? Remember how his isolation is also the only thread keeping the imposter's facade intact? Remember how Mikan is the ultimate nurse and that by committing to the hard-pressed definition of ultimate talent that she could have been capable of dishing out medical treatment far beyond what the school clinic could offer, therefore giving Mitarai no actual reason to leave his room aside from plot contrivance? This is it. This is how I die. From an aneurysm. Junko runs into Ryota by some happy coincidence. Oh yeah, like the happy coincidence that made Trigger Happy Havoc's writing care more about Sakura's death than Celeste's, for example. And asks him who he is. He tells her exactly what, and Junko is overjoyed to have had the luck to have run into him as she puts together that Mitarai is somehow the final piece that she needs to take over the world. If Junko never met Ryota, it was completely unclear how she planned to continue her plot beyond the deaths of the student council a week later. Of course, it would be easy to tack Ryota onto the end of that, but considering how heavily his talent is utilized in the next few stages of Junko's plan, the implication is that he was a part of it all along. Since he clearly wasn't though, why would Junko risk revealing herself in Kamakura if it weren't for the absolute certainty that she would have Mitarai on board with her? Where does the ploy go if it stops with this institution? Logically, it goes nowhere, and that's made even more insulting by what Ryota's talent brings to the table specifically. Junko asks Ryota if she can see his animation, which he allows her to do. After seeing it, Enoshima, the person who has seen it all, is left in tears and she asks why. Mitarai replies by saying that he integrated brainwashing techniques into the video to evoke certain emotions, which gives Junko the idea to use it for even more dastardly means later down the road. Now, if you remember earlier, Mikan Tsumiki had been called into Ryota's living space to check up on his health, and were led to believe that she continues to do so at regular, discrete intervals. During one of these checkups, Mikan goes missing, causing the rest of the class to panic and start a campus-wide search for her. Eventually, when she is found in Mitarai's quarters, she's already been brainwashed by a new despair-inducing video that Enoshima forced upon her. Let me repeat that, but from a slightly different angle. Mitarai's power of animation is so great that it brainwashes Tsumiki into becoming an agent of evil, and of course the rest of the cast gradually follows. Chiaki and Nagito are the first to find Junko, and in defense, Nagito pulls out a gun just before Chiaki stops him from using it on Junko and before Chisa shows up to hold off the attacker. Chisa fails to take down Junko, however, as she falls victim to, you guessed it, brainwashing. I'm not at all fond of this narrative approach because instead of being able to convince the uncertain students of their immaculate power through some narrative persuasion, this change in story is the equivalent of someone just flipping a light switch. 1 second, they're good guys. The next second, they're bad guys, which means that all of the events that we see played out in Trigger Happy Havoc and Goodbye Despair are just the result of one bad brainwashing session. And it's not like the technique of brainwashing hasn't been heard of before. However, if we consider that all throughout this anime there have been several monologues about the virtues of hope and despair and the great spirit of humanity, it's then rather lazy to consider that instead of trying to once again follow this pattern and make some compelling argument about despair over hope, we then just default to doing some narrative light switch. And then the despair arc narrative largely ends on one final event. The death of Chiaki Nanami, which I don't know how I should be upset by. The class searches their campus trying to find their homeroom teacher, leading Chiaki into a secret base hidden underneath Hope's Peak Academy. There, she runs into Chisa Yukizome, who by now is a remnant of despair, despite Chiaki not realizing it and despite Chisa's normally bubbly demeanor. Chisa claims that Chiaki's classmates are, just down that way, before shoving the student into a trap. And this particular trap is set up like a Super Meat Boy or a Crash Bandicoot level, forcing Chiaki to dodge several deadly obstacles in order to reach the goal door. Spurred on by her determination to see her classmates again, she braves several harrowing injuries before reaching the goal door, in which she becomes Swiss cheese. The rest of the class themselves were too late, by several minutes in fact, as her death is replayed to them with some of those wonderful brainwashing features baked into the video, turning them all into the husks we know now. Miraculously though, Chiaki manages to hold on to life for a little while longer, just in time to see Izuru Kamakura walk into the room. However, she doesn't see him as Kamakura, but rather as her friend Hajime Hinata, whom we had seen briefly earlier in the season playing video games with Nanami by one of the school fountains. His transformation that we see here is a result of him being willing to undergo an intensive surgery that was meant to neurologically implant him with basically every ultimate talent known to man. The procedure, however, wipes his memories of being Hajime Hinata, along with those spent with Chiaki Nanami. And despite this, there is a brief moment where he recognized the pincushion on the floor in front of him, and he takes her iconic Galaga pin as a keepsake just as she draws her last breath. So in some ways, I could be upset because Danganronpa very obviously set this character up for death, with her being so likable and going through a small amount of character development along the way. I could also be upset by the fact that her death was the result of a lazy narrative structure designed to usher the series along, since they realistically only had 11 episodes to cram all this information into. What I'm even more upset by, though, is how the future arc, or I suppose the Hope special episode, ties up this whole series by the end of it, because once again, and this time by making poor retroactive changes. So while the anime may be the best installment because of how it feels much more natural for the narrative, it completely butchers the ending of Goodbye Despair while also lazily setting up specific narrative ends whose payoff lies more in their shock value. Annoyingly enough, there are several minutes worth of characters spouting the same platitudes that we've already heard repeated several times over in the games for the sake of pointless filler content. Then, when a character is about to die, the anime suddenly remembers it needs to give the audience a reason to care about them. And then it tries to condense their sad backstory into the space of a few minutes, when they clearly already had several opportunities to develop these characters up until this point. Alright, so I'm going to spoil the ending of Season 1 of Final Space, a TV show a lot of you probably don't know about, but I'm going to use as a narrative example anyway. In Season 1, this character, Avocado, forget the name, dies in a heroic effort to save his son, and it's a tragic death because his entire backstory is told in a 30-second flashback. No, quite contrary actually. For the majority of Season 1, we see this character grow and develop their personality, and they share experiences with the other characters and, by proxy, us, the audience. His death is tragic because it felt like it was moving up to something. This stream of information and growth that we had come to learn over the space of a season is tragically cut very short. So instead, in this anime, when someone dies, it's just, here's a quick snap of their information, and poof, they're gone. Oh, gee, I wonder if there was ever any opportunity for this character to turn into an actual character and he wasn't cock-blocked by several untimely monologues.
Wow, we're 3 pieces of media in and I had no idea this was about hope versus despair.
Goodbye Despair ends with the phrase of, if you die in the game, you die in real life, meaning that everyone's death was highly consequential. DR3 ends with an entire segment dedicated to showing off how Kamakura managed to revive all the students placed into the Neo World program, meaning that none of the hours that I spent in this game had any consequence. But the same isn't applied to Chiaki or any of the characters from Trigger Happy Havoc. Those people are dead all the way to Sunday because even Spike Chunsoft recognizes how extreme those mental gymnastics would be. After all, considering how poorly put together the other timelines are in the anime, I'm surprised that this wasn't the worst reveal out of all of them, because Mitarai's existence and talent are detrimental because it boils down to how the entire world is torn apart after some talented high schoolers watched his homemade Elsagate videos. It's fucking awful. Over in the future arc though, the final killing game is ended by, get this, turning off the power to the building. There was no killer to begin with. Junko has been dead for a while now, and Tengan was the one who set everything up. Everyone who died from the killing game directly was brainwashed into committing suicide in the space of less than an hour. Okay. So this not only compounds my problems with Ryota's power being widely used and unlimited in scope, but it also ruins any shock reveal that the game's had from discovering a killer. In an ideal world, there would have been one person in particular that was tasked with being the killer, someone that could have blended in and been the perfect character to look over. Enter Chisa Yukizome. Chisa's betrayal of Chiaki and conversion to an agent of despair is fully realized much later in the future arc, well after her death in the very first episode. How much more interesting and consistent would it have been for the alive and amiable homeroom teacher to have a well-hidden dark side that could eventually clash with her closest companions, Kyosuke and Juzo? If her betrayal was discovered later in the anime, and she genuinely was the killer, then these monologues that Kyosuke delivers would become tantamount in a moment of confrontation. Sure, he can talk all big about killing Makoto for the greater good of the world and for the sake of eliminating despair because he doesn't care about him. But what if there's undeniable proof that one of his closest alive friends is a remnant themselves? Would Kyosuke still be willing to cut them down in the name of hope? Surely I'm not the only one who thinks that this path, any path, was better than the anime rolling over and washing its hands of responsibility to any of its characters. Even though Trigger Happy Havoc set up the framework and Goodbye Despair expanded upon it, we are now seeing flagrant examples of how... Now, two characters I've overlooked for the majority of this segment's runtime are Monaka Toa and Izuru Kamakura. Monaka is a character from the Ultra Despair Girls game, which is set between the events of DR2 and the anime. I've never played UDG, nor do I have any interest in doing so, so I read a basic plot summary to understand who was in it and who Monaka was.
So it turns out I missed a lot.
The episode that we see Monaka in feels more like an apology for forgetting about UDG up until this point. In Ultra Despair Girls, Toko from Trigger Happy Havoc is united with Makoto Naeki's younger sister, and together with a bunch of other relative nobodies, they manage to hold back the effects of despair from taking over at least their corner of the world. Nagito Komaeda also shows up at some point in the game. I'm not too clear on that one. The key feature of Monaka is that she's a real deceptive piece of work, pretending to be crippled for most of the game so as to diffuse any suspicion that she was capable of being an agent of evil. And it's eventually revealed that she was faking her disability all along, and from there I got lost. The way that her bio is worded on the wiki makes it seem like she's not actually evil but wants to seek the truth behind everything, hence the reason why she's even in DR3. But since there are too many words here, and I've written too many words here, I'll stick to what I know from the anime itself. In the anime, Monaka kills the original Gekogahara and replaces her with a remote-controlled robot replica in hopes of infiltrating the Future Foundation and figuring out what really makes them tick. I thought her mission was something along the true neutral kind of path, like she was also in some path of self-discovery along the way, but the episode centered around her definitely indicates otherwise. She constantly talks about wanting to overtake the position that her sister Junko Enoshima has taken as the ultimate despair. And Naegi and Toko go to find Monaka in her tower after fighting through waves of Monokuma clones. These assholes show up for 7 seconds even though I have no idea who they are. Then when the dynamic duo try to confront her, Monaka just gives up. In the final confrontations between Monaka, Komaru, and Toko though, the final thing that we're left with is that Monaka is just lazy. She was doing all of her things because she was born, but then lacked the emotional drive to follow through on her plans. So let me get this straight. She spent most of UDG being an extreme manipulator, killed a person with an ultimate talent, had a perfect replica robot with some insane capabilities built afterwards, saves Makoto's life on several occasions with it, and then her character is resolved by being so lazy that she doesn't want to tie up her own loose ends. Why? Why is Danganronpa so afraid of committing to consequences and rounding out its important characters? Like, God, I'm pissed off and I haven't gotten to you yet. Speaking of Izuru Kamakura, or as we know him initially, Hajime Hinata, this guy. Hope's Peak Academy decided that looking for ultimate talents wasn't enough, and they wanted to create the ultimate talent wielder through human experimentation. Most of the funding for the school itself was already being siphoned into the main course students, the ones with actual talents, the ones we've encountered so far. And since the money for scouting out talents and keeping up the school kept the budget tight, the reserve course was created to allow regular students to pay tuition to have a chance of being accepted into the main course, when in reality their funds were being used for the human experiment. That human experiment eventually being the reserve course student Hajime Hinata, who has the hopes of Hope's Peak Academy on his mind at all times. Hajime is taken into the experiment, and when he emerges, he has no memory of anybody except for Chiaki at her death much later on. He also has a great hair care routine. I want to know what he uses. None of this is terribly offensive, and neither is his involvement in the series for the most part. Sure, he doesn't do anything, but it plays well into the character that he's written to be. Problem is that when he is actually given something to do, the only things he does are only ever explained by him being omnipotent. He has luck. Okay, sure, that's showcased, but then every other time his skills are used, it's in scenarios that are off-screen and extremely important. Now, remember several pages ago when I said that the people in Goodbye Despair died in real life even though they died in the simulation? Well, it turns out that because Kamakura is so good at everything, he managed to reverse the death effects of the Neo World program, and everyone that died in the game didn't die in real life. Except for Chiaki, she's extremely dead now. So the emotional impact of losing everyone in DR2 is completely wasted because of how this character is written. It's like, the format for the anime was great, and it fits the style of Danganronpa just fine, but the writing at the end of the day makes me feel just so tired, man. And that's all of the mainline entries into the Danganronpa series. There's not a single one that adds anything to this universe, so as far as we all know, we're safe on this whatever the hell this continuity is. At the end of the day though, after over 35 pages worth of writing, I think I can come away from Danganronpa moderately satisfied with it. I'm not overly fond of visual novels, I'm not too keen on anime writing, and might have spent the majority of the video picking sequential events and pointing out how awful they are, but in reality, I kind of like the series, and especially Goodbye Despair. It's an over-the-top science fiction series that takes itself way too seriously a lot of the time, leading us to this extremely convoluted timeline that tries to make sense of itself. The characters were great, they're memorable, the designs were really cool to look at, the murder mysteries themselves and the ways that they were set up to be super convoluted was really entertaining to follow for a lot of the series. But the problem being that the writing in between sounds like it was written by AI or by aliens trying to imitate how humans talk, and they got kinda close, but the rest of the delivery and the ways that characters interact with each other does not sound natural in the slightest, and it really derails from the experience that this game can have as a whole. Hi, you've made it to the end of the video where I am severely questioning my life choices. And for now, I just want to take some time to talk about the process that goes into putting these kinds of videos out, because that's something that I've never done before, and it might be a nice distraction for the curious. So what I do is I find a property that I'm interested in, whether it be a game, a movie, or even a TV show at this point, and I try to complete said title, and if something has a lasting impression on me, I start writing a script. You know, what were the most striking features of this title, what were the most impressions that I was left with, and why do I feel that way? Now this ends up getting convoluted pretty quickly, as you can tell with this video, because the way that I feel about one thing is affected by another thing in the story, and it all falls apart from there. I don't generally try to be negative with these reviews and such, and that is something that I want to change going forward. It just happens the things that I'm able to hyperfixate on often end up being the negative, because I want to see what I enjoy be better than it is. Quite often, though, I find that that isn't very well communicated, and I piss a lot of people off, which is just a shortcoming on my part and something that I want to endeavor to do better. This script was actually mostly written like 2 years ago, and that was when I was still kind of in this angry writing phase, and when I came back to it and started fixing things up, I felt like I had already written enough for me to not want to go back over it, but I still do kind of regret it because of the tone that I have brought to it specifically. And two videos that I can think of that are reminiscent of this are the videos that I did on Sunless Skies and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, two of my favorite games. Both games are beautiful, atmospheric experiences that are easy to pick up and are extremely rewarding to master, and I personally considered learning and have tried learning some speedruns for Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Ori and the Will of the Wisps. It's a consonants, it's just a bunch of syllables in there. But I've considered learning speedruns for it because that's how much I love the game, that I want to learn how to play it as efficiently as possible, which requires me to put a ton of hours into it. But because I was so negative and so angry in the script that I had written for it specifically, it led a lot of people to believe that I didn't actually love Ori and the Will of the Wisps. I got it right that time. One comment on the Ori video stated that it sounded like I didn't actually like the game, and another on the Sunless Sky video said something to the effect of like, oh, if you didn't like this game, then why did you play it? Because it's obviously not meant for you. It's like, damn, okay, like I really didn't get my point across, did I? Don't go back and watch those videos, by the way. They both suck. Take my word for it. But because I feel the need to make myself extremely clear while touching on every important detail to point out that I know that specific story beats exist, these scripts take a lot of time and effort to write. And heck, a preliminary estimate on this script states that it's about 40 pages long, which gives me a video that will land around the, hour and 20-minute mark. Then, after the script or script segment is done, I record the audio in Audacity, which I'm doing right now. I try to go on saying as much as I can without taking a breath because the audio of my lips smacking or inhaling is super distracting to me. And occasionally this leads to cuts where the pause between the end of an old sentence and the start of a new sounds unnatural, but those details are ones that I can't be worried about. What this means is that I pause in between every time I need to take a breath, then I go back, remove the cut, and then crossfade between the cuts to make sure that I don't have any sort of clipping audio in between them. And then after I've gone through and finished splicing all that segment's audio together, I throw on a compressor that levels out the audio, then I normalize it to -4 decibels. This means that my peaks will be at -4, and my usual talking voice floats at around -12 to -8. Then, once I've finished recording audio, it's on to the gathering footage phase, which differs from property to property. For movies and TV shows, it's about finding the clips that I'm referencing or need specifically, and for video games, I'm usually writing down timestamps while I'm playing through them. Then comes the editing, which is by far the toughest part because I have to listen to my own voice for several hours on end, and I have to arrange the previously gathered footage in a way that satisfies the little gremlin in my head. I don't know how to explain it. It's just this kind of pervasive feeling like, oh, this meme would be funny here, or hey, we should do this transition, or this kind of effect to just mix things up a little bit here. Editing is also what I spend the most time on because getting timing done correctly is an arduous process, and also my editing software sucks. It's awful for efficiency, something which I'll probably rant about on my Light channel at some point, I'm sure. Then, once all the editing is done, I finish it, and I upload to around 200 people. Since I'm the one who escorts the whole process along, you can probably see why it takes me so long to upload, but I'm not apologizing for it, because why would I? Videos get done when they get done, and at this point I know it's the best that I can do. Besides, it's not like I'm holding up sponsorships or have a massive audience to come back to. This is a hobby that's mostly for me and for my own interests. Problem is that some of these projects, like this one, drive me a little bit insane. So finally, now that you've waited to the end of the video, thank you for sitting all of whatever this was. And I'll use this time now to explain what's going on with the channel. So first off, you probably noticed the change in the channel banner and icon. To make a long story short, I wanted to update everything to fit myself a little bit better. The old icon doesn't look like me, quite simply, and since I know how to talk to artists now, I managed to get something that actually fits me really well. Then there's the banner, which is just Sojourner, and then my Mandarin name at the very end of it, just Kai. So new logo, new approach to content. I know that y'all don't expect much from me, but I want to stop making Games with Friends content and lean into more longer video essays like this one. Main reason being that Games of Friends are kind of hard for me to make, not because the content isn't fresh or not because the videos don't do well. I actually think that my Games with Friends videos do quite well overall, and they're very enjoyable to come back to, but because the format always feels really similar. Zoom here, add effects here, superimpose a stock image there. It all feels very samey to me. With a video essay, I'm allowed to explore more specific subject matter and take as much time as I need to work with what's basically a blank slate. I can also take the time I need to fully extrapolate on my points, unlike what I've done here, because the script is old and I was getting kind of tired of writing it. And so, yeah, that's all I wanted to say here. Next video will be next week, since a continuation of this video, and hopefully a little higher quality than this one as well. With all that said, thank you all once again so much for your time. Safe travels, and goodbye.